Ladies and gentlemen, in the fast-paced world we live in today, our minds are constantly bombarded with noise. From the moment we wake up, notifications flood our phones, emails demand our attention, and the never-ending scroll of social media keeps us engaged. There's the chatter of the news, the pressures of work, the expectations of family, and the endless opinions of the world. With so many voices competing for our focus, it becomes almost impossible to hear the one voice that truly matters, God's voice. His voice isn't found in the chaos, nor is it loud and overpowering like the distractions that dominate our daily lives. Instead, it's subtle, gentle, and often requires an intentional effort to recognize. Imagine trying to have a meaningful conversation in the middle of a crowded, noisy street. The honking of cars, the chatter of passers-by, the blaring music from nearby shops, it's overwhelming. Even if someone right next to you is speaking, their voice gets drowned out by all the surrounding noise. That's exactly how it is when we try to hear God's voice while being consumed by the distractions of the world. It's not that He isn't speaking, that we're not in a position to listen. His words are there, waiting for us to tune in, but we need to create the space for His voice to be heard. One of the biggest obstacles to hearing God is the sheer amount of mental clutter we carry. Our thoughts are constantly racing worries about the future, regrets about the past, lists of things to do, and anxieties about things we can't control. When our minds are this full, there's no room left for clarity. It's like trying to pour fresh water into a cup that's already overflowing with murky liquid. No matter how much fresh water is added, it just spills over, making no real impact. The same goes for our ability to hear God. If our minds are too cluttered with worldly concerns, His voice will get lost in the overflow. It's not just external noise that distracts you, it's the internal noise as well. Self-doubt, insecurities, and negative thoughts can be just as loud as the chaos of the outside world. These inner voices can drown out God's guidance, making it difficult to distinguish between His truth and our fears. When we're constantly second-guessing ourselves, questioning our worth, or dwelling on past mistakes, we're not in a place to hear the voice that reassures, guides, and uplifts us. His voice is one of love, peace, and wisdom, but it requires us to quiet the negative self-talk and create space for Him to speak. In a world that glorifies busyness, silence is often seen as unproductive. We've been conditioned to believe that if we're not constantly doing something, we're wasting time. This mindset makes it difficult for many people to embrace stillness. But silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of awareness. When we intentionally set aside time to be still, we create a sacred space where God's voice can reach us. It's in these moments of quiet that we become most receptive to His wisdom. Throughout history, some of the most profound encounters with God have happened in moments of stillness. Moses encountered God in the quiet of the burning bush. Elijah heard His whisper in the stillness after the storm. Jesus often withdrew to solitary places to pray and connect with the Father. These moments weren't coincidental. They were intentional. Each of these individuals understood that to truly hear from God, they had to step away from the distractions of the world and into a place of undisturbed connection. When we take a step back from the noise, we begin to notice things we were too distracted to see before. We start recognizing the subtle ways God has been speaking to us all along. Maybe it's through the gentle nudge in our spirit, the unexpected encouragement from a friend, or the way a particular Bible verse stands out at just the right moment. God's voice isn't always a grand, dramatic revelation. It's often found in the everyday moments we overlook. Creating an environment where we can hear God requires intentionality. It means setting boundaries with the things that steal our focus. It may mean taking breaks from social media, limiting the time spent consuming news, or being mindful of the content we allow into our hearts and minds. It's about making space for stillness, whether through prayer, meditation, or simply sitting in silence and reflecting. When we take these steps, we begin to train our ears to recognize His voice in a way we never could before. Many people assume that hearing God requires some supernatural experience, but the truth is, He's already speaking. The problem isn't that He's silent, it's that we're not listening. The more we allow noise to dominate our lives, the harder it becomes to discern His voice. But when we make the choice to silence the distractions, we open ourselves to a level of guidance and clarity. God's voice is not always loud, booming, or dramatic. More often than not, it is a whisper, subtle, gentle, and easy to overlook. Many people expect God to speak in grand, unmistakable ways, like a thunderous voice from the heavens, or an undeniable miracle that changes everything in an instant. But throughout history, God has often chosen to speak in the quiet, in the small moments that require attention and sensitivity to notice. His voice is not about volume, but about clarity, and those who are willing to listen closely will hear him in ways that change their lives. There is a story in the Bible about the prophet Elijah that illustrates this truth. After a great victory, Elijah found himself discouraged and hiding in a cave, feeling abandoned and afraid. He was desperate to hear from God, hoping for a powerful display of his presence. Then, something extraordinary happened. A great wind tore through the mountains, strong enough to shatter rocks, but God was not in the wind. After that came an earthquake, shaking the ground beneath Elijah's feet, but God was not in the earthquake. Then a roaring fire blazed through, yet still, God was not in the fire. Finally, after all the noise had passed, there came a still small voice, a gentle whisper. It was in that whisper that Elijah finally heard God. This story reveals something profound about the way God communicates. He is fully capable of speaking through dramatic events, but more often he speaks in ways that require stillness and attentiveness. The problem is that many people miss these whispers because they are looking for something bigger. They want an obvious sign, a miraculous confirmation, something that leaves no room for doubt. But God's whispers are often invitations to lean in closer, to quiet the noise of life, and to develop a deeper relationship with him. Recognizing the whisper of God requires a heart that is open and a mind that is willing to slow down. In a world filled with constant distractions, it is easy to become desensitized to the subtle ways in which he speaks. People are conditioned to seek instant gratification, immediate answers, and loud confirmations. Social media, entertainment, and daily responsibilities keep minds occupied from morning until night. With all this noise, the still, small voice of God can easily be drowned out. But just because it is quiet does not mean it is not present. It simply means that it requires intentionality to hear. One of the ways God whispers is through his word. The Bible is full of wisdom, guidance, and promises, yet it often speaks in ways that require reflection. A verse that may seem ordinary at first can suddenly take on deep personal meaning in the right moment. A passage that has been read dozens of times before can suddenly feel like it was written specifically for a current situation. This is not coincidence, it is God speaking. His word is alive, but it takes a listening heart to recognize when he is using it to communicate something specific. Another way God whispers is through the circumstances of life. Sometimes a door closing is not rejection, but redirection. Sometimes an unexpected opportunity is not luck, but divine positioning. Sometimes a delay is not a denial, but protection from something unseen. God orchestrates events in ways that may not be obvious at first, but those who pay attention will see his fingerprints all over their lives. It is in these seemingly small moments that his voice is often the clearest. God also speaks through the inner voice of conviction. There are moments when a thought or feeling arises that seems to come from nowhere, a sudden sense of peace about a difficult decision, an unexplainable certainty about which direction to take, or an unexpected nudge to reach out to someone. These whispers are not random. They are often God's way of guiding, warning, or encouraging. The more a person listens to these inner promptings, the more they begin to recognize when God is speaking. There are times when God's whisper comes through other people. A friend may say something that directly addresses a situation without even realizing it. A sermon or message may feel as though it was meant specifically for that moment. A stranger's words may bring unexpected comfort or confirmation. These moments are not coincidences. They are divine appointments. God often uses others to speak, but it takes a listening heart to recognize when he is doing so. Recognizing God's whisper requires trust. It is easy to doubt whether a quiet nudge or thought is truly from him. Fear of being wrong can lead to hesitation, and overanalyzing can cause a person to dismiss what was actually God speaking. But faith is about stepping forward, even when the voice is gentle. God does not always provide all the details at once. Sometimes he gives just enough for the next step. Those who trust his whispers and trusting the direction God gives is one of the most important yet challenging aspects of faith. Often, people seek his voice, asking for guidance, but when the answer comes, doubt, fear, and hesitation creep in. The human mind naturally desires certainty, a clear roadmap with no room for error, but God doesn't always work that way. His direction often requires trust before understanding, obedience before clarity, and faith before results. It is in this surrender that true purpose is discovered, yet so many struggle with taking that first step when they don't see the full picture. One of the biggest reasons people hesitate to trust God's direction is the fear of making the wrong choice. They want absolute assurance that they are hearing correctly, that if they step forward, everything will fall perfectly into place. But faith is not about having all the answers, it is about trusting the one who does. God rarely gives the full picture up front. Instead, he provides just enough for the next step, requiring dependence on him rather than on personal logic or reasoning. He is not interested in making things easy. He is interested in deepening faith. In the Bible, Abraham was called by God to leave his home and go to a land that God would show him. Not a land that was fully mapped out, not a destination with all the details in place, just a promise that God would reveal it along the way. Abraham had no blueprint, no GPS, no timeline, yet he trusted and obeyed. That kind of trust is what God desires from his people, the willingness to follow even when the full destination is unknown. This kind of obedience is not always comfortable. It requires stepping into the unfamiliar, leaving behind the security of what is known, and embracing the uncertainty of what God is leading toward. Trusting God's direction also means letting go of personal timelines. People often struggle when God's timing doesn't align with their expectations. They pray for doors to open immediately, for solutions to come quickly, for things to fall into place exactly as they imagined. But God operates on a different timeline. What seems like a delay is often divine preparation. A door that remains closed is not always rejection, but rather protection. God sees what is ahead and knows what is needed for the journey. When he says wait, it is not to frustrate, but to prepare. And when he says go, it is because the timing is perfect, even if it doesn't feel that way. Another struggle people face in trusting God's direction is the pressure of external voices. The world is full of opinions, advice, and expectations. Society has its own standards for success. Family members have their own plans, and friends have their own ideas about what is best. These voices can sometimes drown out the quiet leading of God. What he calls someone to do may not always make sense to others. It may look illogical, risky, or even foolish in the eyes of the world. But God's ways are higher, and his plans do not require validation from people. Trusting his direction means being willing to follow, even when others do not understand. There are times when God's direction leads to unexpected places. A person may feel called to a career path that is different from what they originally envisioned. They may be led to a city they never planned to live in. They may be asked to step away from something familiar and into something completely unknown. God's plans are often far greater than what the human mind can conceive. He leads to places that align with his purpose, not just personal comfort. Many of the greatest blessings come from places that were never in the original plan, but they were always in God's plan. Trusting God's direction also means releasing control. Many people want to hear God's voice, but they also want to maintain their grip on the outcome. They want to follow as long as they can still dictate how things unfold. But true trust requires surrender. It means being willing to follow without trying to manipulate the results. It means accepting that God's way may not always align with personal preferences, but it is always better. Holding on to control often leads to frustration, while surrender leads to peace. One of the most challenging aspects of trusting God's direction is moving forward even when the path is difficult. Sometimes obedience leads to immediate blessings, but other times it leads to seasons of testing. Joseph in the Bible received a dream from God about his future. But before that dream came to pass, he faced betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. From the outside, it may have seemed like he had taken a wrong turn, but in reality, he was exactly where God needed him to be. Every step, even the painful ones, was leading him closer to the fulfillment of God's plan. Trusting God means believing that even when things don't look ideal, he is still in control, still working, and still listening to God's voice is only the first step. The real transformation happens when action follows. Many people hear God's prompting, feel his leading, and sense his direction, but they hesitate when it's time to move. They wait for perfect conditions, for complete understanding, for reassurance that nothing will go wrong. But faith requires movement. Acting on what God says, even when the outcome is uncertain, is where true growth happens. It is in obedience that faith is strengthened, doors open, and his plans unfold. Hearing is important, but it is action that brings change. Fear is one of the greatest obstacles to stepping out in faith. It whispers doubts, magnifies insecurities, and creates a list of reasons to stay still. What if it doesn't work? What if I fail? What if I misunderstood what God was saying? These questions often paralyze people, keeping them in a cycle of hesitation. But fear will always be present when stepping into the unknown. The difference between those who fulfill God's calling and those who don't is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move forward despite it. Courage is not about never feeling afraid, it is about choosing to act in faith anyway. There are countless examples in the Bible of people who acted in faith even when they didn't have all the answers. Noah built an ark before the rain ever came. Moses stretched his staff over the Red Sea before it parted. Peter stepped out of the boat before he knew if he could walk on water. In each of these moments, action came before the miracle. The breakthrough didn't happen first, obedience did. God often asks for movement before results, for trust before evidence. Those who are willing to take that first step, even without a full picture, are the ones who experience His power in ways they never imagined. Sometimes the action required is small. It may not be a major life decision or a dramatic change. It might be a simple act of kindness, a conversation that needs to happen, a small adjustment in daily habits, or a step toward a long-term goal. God's instructions are not always grand gestures. Sometimes they are whispers calling for small acts of obedience that lead to bigger things. It is often in the small steps that faith is built, and as obedience grows, so does the confidence to take on greater challenges. There is also a misconception that acting in faith means knowing every step of the journey. Many people wait for a full blueprint, for God to lay out the entire plan before they move. But He rarely works that way. More often, He gives just enough light for the next step, requiring dependence on Him rather than personal understanding. The journey of faith is walked step by step, not all at once. Trusting that God will provide the next direction when the time is right is part of the process. The key is to take the step that is already clear, no matter how small it may seem. One of the challenges of acting on God's voice is that His instructions do not always align with human logic. What He asks may seem counterintuitive, unexpected, or even impractical. He may call someone to leave a secure job, invest in something that seems risky, pursue a path that others don't understand, or speak up when silence is easier. The mind naturally wants to calculate, analyze, and ensure that every move makes sense. But faith is not based on logic alone, it is based on trust. When God speaks, it may not always make sense in the moment, but obedience always leads to His greater plan. Another challenge is patience. Sometimes people act on God's word but don't see immediate results. They expect instant confirmation, immediate success, or a quick reward for their obedience. But faith is a journey, not a transaction. God's promises are true, but they often unfold in His timing, not human timing. The waiting period can be discouraging, but it is also where faith is refined. The greatest breakthroughs often come after seasons of persistence, where trust is tested and perseverance is required. Doubt can creep in when the results are not immediate. People begin to question if they heard God correctly, if they made the right choice, or if they should turn back. The enemy often plants seeds of doubt in moments of waiting, trying to convince people that their step of faith was a mistake. But obedience is never wasted. Even when the outcome is not yet visible, God is always working behind the scenes. Sometimes He is preparing circumstances, other times He is preparing the person. Growth happens in the process, and those who remain steadfast will see the fulfillment of what God promised. Faith-driven action also requires letting go of the fear of people's opinions. Many hesitate to move forward because they worry about what others will think. They fear judgment, criticism, or rejection. But obedience to God cannot be dependent on the approval of others.